Let me introduce our next speaker. So Professor David Bow is an assistant professor at the Northeastern University, Khoury College of Computer Science. He received his PhD from MIT and AB from Harvard, and he has previously worked at Google and Microsoft. He is known for his network dissection studies of individual neurons in deep networks and has published research on the interpretable structure learned computations in large models in venues such as CVPR, NeurIPS, and SIGGRAPH. Prof. Bow is also co-author of the textbook Numerical Linear Algebra. So everyone, let's welcome Prof. David for his speech. I'll hand over the session now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Let me, I'm going to see if I can share my slides here. If I can find the proper window to do this. Let's see here. This looks right. So,
yep, we can see.
Okay, excellent. So I'm really glad to be here today to talk to you. It looks like it's quite a group. And I hope everything is well. It was great to get a chance to come here. I met Sandrika at AAAI a couple years ago, and there's a few of us who are very interested in interpretable machine learning, and that's going to be what I talk about with you today. Today I'm going to talk about really large models, and I'm going to talk about how to directly understand them, visualize and understand them through direct causal interventions on these large models, something I call direct model editing. And it's all motivated by this main question. If I can figure out how to advance my slides, which is, what does my AI know? Right? That's what we want to know. And how does it know it? And when we're working with big AI, AIs that seem to grow more amazing capabilities every month, every year. There are new AI models that can do amazing things that we thought were impossible. I think this question of what my AI knows and how it knows it actually becomes a more and more important mystery. And so let me give you an example of a very recent one. So you're probably all familiar with DALL-E 2, DALL-E, right? This is the AI that was recently released by OpenAI, and it can take any piece of text and use it to produce an image. So, for example, if I take the text, a photo of a bedroom with a lamp, then it'll actually produce an output like this. This is a real output from DALL-E 2. And it knows how to do it. It will generate random photos of lamps. If you run the model repeatedly, it produces images like this. So this is just a random sample. And it's quite striking, right? It has a lot of diversity. It seems to be capable of drawing lots of different types of bedrooms, different types of lamps. And then notice, like, it even knows things like how the light scatters from these lamps. I find this quite amazing. You can look at that table. You see the specular reflections, and so these models are obviously quite capable. And you can tell it anything. You can just give it any piece of English description, and it will generate an image for you. So let me give you this provocation then, right? Because you look at these models, you think they're so amazing, but they're so capable, it makes you think, why should we work so hard at understanding AI? We can just teach them to speak English and tell them what we want to know, right? What's the maybe that's what we should do. So let's do this here with DALL-E. So I'm so amazed by the lights in DALL-E. If we ask it not just draw a photo of a bedroom with a lamp, but I'm interested in lights. So let's ask it to draw photos of a lit lamp in a bedroom, and it can do that quite well. And we have these nice examples of lit lamps. Okay, so now what I really want to do is I want to compare this to how DALL-E draws photos of bedrooms with unlit lamps, right? So let's ask DALL-E to do that. And so this is what we get. So this is not really working. These lamps are all lit, but maybe maybe DALL-E doesn't really understand the word unlit. That's maybe an unusual word. So this is unlit lamp. Let's try a darkened lamp, right? That's what we get. So dark lamps look like this. What if we were really explicit and we asked for lamps that are turned off? This is what we get. And you can see pretty much none of these are working. So how do we go to one of these models and get lights that are turned off? How can we turn the lights off? So what I'm showing you here is an example of how very capable models can have these problems in them. And what's an example of is how big data can be a really difficult human interface. So what we've done here is, DALL-E has been trained on this massive data set. Curating the data set was a huge project. And then after they created this data set of, I say millions here, is actually billions of images with captions that was used to train DALL-E 2. Training the model is a huge project, right? It can take days or weeks of training, and massive amounts of energy. It's something that's very difficult to repeat. But at the end of it, we get this model of a data set that has a lot of structure in it, but it may contain a lot of unknown biases and unknown correlations. So learning from a data set like this is amazingly powerful, but it's also incredibly opaque and hard to anticipate. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with missing concepts or mistakes or ambiguities? How do we know what it is that the model learned? So the idea of direct model editing, right, is to try to connect the user or the programmer more directly with the AI model. So the idea is, allow a user to understand and control the mechanisms of the large model directly without a big piece of data in between. It's something that we can enable by giving a user direct access to the weights of a model. So let me show you an example of doing this here. This is actually a project that's centered on the idea of how to turn lamps on and off. These experiments were done by Audrey Cooey, and it was a collaboration with the Signify company that actually makes the Philips lighting project. So they're quite interested in lights, and so here's what Audrey worked on here. So what she did is she started with an off-the-shelf StyleGAN, right, a generative adversarial network trained on bedrooms. Oh, give me a second here. I have to turn off a feature in PowerPoint that's advancing automatically for me. Okay. We'll go back here, and I'm going to have Zoom reshare. Share the screen. Okay, that's great. So she started with an off-the-shelf StyleGAN, and so StyleGAN is a generative adversarial network, and the way it works is it's just a function, right? It's a large function. It has 30 million parameters, but conceptually it's really simple. If you input a random vector, then it does a bunch of arithmetic, and then within a few milliseconds, it outputs a random realistic image. This is a generator that was trained on generating bedrooms, and it'll output a random realistic image of a bedroom. And if you switch the random vector to another random input, then you get a different room out, right? And so sometimes you do this and you get this nice lamp in the room. This is an older model than the diffusion model that was used by DALL-E, but it's also capable of drawing realistic lamps with reflections on the walls and so on. And it also has this interesting problem, which is if you try to steer the model using language, then you find that you're unable to turn the lamps on and off, like using a language model like CLIP. But instead, of trying to steer the network from the outside, what Audrey did was she cracked open the model to ask, how does the model represent the concept of light coming from lamps internally on the inside, right? So she asked, is there a neuron that it uses to think about lamplight? So this network has thousands of neurons, but it's just a program. So using direct model editing methods, you can easily trace through it to figure out parts of what it does. Now that might sound complicated, but it's actually really simple. And so here's all you do. And this is what Audrey did basically. She started with a single image that's generated by a model. She picked an image that generated the thing that she was interested in, which is a lamp throwing light on the wall, like this. And then she took that one image and then she just annotated the parts of it by hand that she was interested in explaining. So these little yellow balls here are the parts that she painted. She says she's interested in how the lamp is casting light on the wall and how the model is reasoning about that. So I don't know what these little reflections are called. They kind of look like umbras, but umbra means like a shadow, sort of the opposite of an umbra. So I don't know if these things have a name, but I can draw it on them, and so when we do that, it allows us to define a way of hunting for neurons that control these particular types of light castings. And so here's how we can find neurons that control these things. So first of all, we go to any individual neuron in the network, and we can zero it out. And when we zero it out, we get an image that might look a little different from the image that we started with. It will still be capable of generating an image, but it'll be changed somewhat. And we can look at the difference between the changed image with that neuron zeroed and our original image. So here's literally a pixel difference here that I'm showing. And then we can compare the pixel differences in the regions that you're interested in and score the image, or not score the image, score the neuron. Here we're scoring neurons based on how much of the difference lands in these target areas that you're interested in. And then you can do this test on every single neuron. It only takes a few seconds to loop through all the neurons and do this test. And then you get this nice search ranking function to rank which neurons had the largest causal effect on this particular part of the image that you're interested in. And so let me show you what the neurons look like that you get out of here. You get a ranking of neurons that you can visualize with these differences like this, and you get neurons that do all sorts of interesting things. So for example, here's a neuron that actually controls task lighting and reflections. This is one for lampshade size. This is a neuron that controls reflections only and not direct light coming out of the lamps. This neuron here actually controls the warmth of the lighting, how blue or brown it is in the room, and so you can see how the model, this GAN, has chosen to decompose the problem of controlling light by understanding its neurons. By understanding its neurons, we're sort of understanding the GAN's, the network's own internal language of how it's reasoning about the scene. So when you score thousands of neurons like this, you get this nice neuron vocabulary, and the interesting thing about it is these neurons generalize. So if you take that very first top ranking neuron and you go to an image generated by the ScaleGAN and you turn it on and off, you can see what the effects are. It controls light coming from lamps, and it works in any generated scene that has a lamp. So here's just a demonstration of toggling that single neuron on and off. And so this is just an example of what we can get out of models if we understand their internal structure. Here's another example. So on the left is just another scene showing just another lamp that you can turn on and off. On the right, I'm actually controlling a different neuron. This was the 4th ranked neuron in the causal neuron ranking. This is not the main neuron that dims light. This is the one that controls the color temperature from very yellow to very blue. And so you can see that as you change that neuron, it makes it a little bit warmer light or cooler light. And you can see it sort of casts that different color light to different parts of the room, which is very interesting. So what we did was, so this is really what direct model editing is all about, right? It's about trying to allow a user to specify the thing that they're interested in, the question they have about the model. How does the model know a certain thing? And then search for causal computations in the model, how the model computes those things. And then you test those causal computations by actually making the causal change, altering the network, and seeing what the outputs are. So even if we don't have an English label for a concept like color temperature, right? The internal structure of the model shows that we can actually find that concept inside the model. So that's the power of direct editing. Let me show you another example here. So StyleGAN is a pretty neat generative model. I'm going to show you an example on a much larger model than StyleGAN, like more than 1,000 times bigger. So StyleGAN has about 30 million parameters with an M, and GPT has several billion parameters with a B. So this is a much larger model. We can also ask what it knows. And as large as it is, GPT, again, it's a conceptually simple model, right? It's just a function. As input, you give it a series of words, it does a bunch of arithmetic, and as output, it produces a prediction, a guess of what the next word will be. So here, the input is the words Edmund Neupert performing on the, and then as it does all these computations and as output, it produces the word that GPT thinks should come next, which is the word piano. So you might not know, but Edmund Neupert is a famous 18th century pianist. So GPT-2 here is right, which is kind of amazing. It leads to this question: what does GPT know? It seems to know a lot of things. So here's a few more examples of sentence completions about other people. So if you say Miles Davis plays the something, right, it will say the trumpet. Niccolo Paganini plays as a master of the violin. Jimi Hendrix knows that Jimi Hendrix is a guitarist. So it knows all these people. Niccolo Paganini is another famous 18th century musician. He's I didn't know, but GPT-2 knew it. And so what's interesting thing is that what we normally think of as abstract facts about things, facts that you might store in a database or a knowledge graph, GPT seems to contain in its neural network a pretty large internal knowledge base of facts that it can express as language predictions about words. And so this idea of containing facts in a model has been studied by a bunch of labs. Petroni has been looking at this. And there's a lot of ways to say the same fact. So Jiang noticed that if you use slightly different language to extract facts from a model, you can get better performance than other ways. And when you try a lot of different wordings for getting facts out of GPT, it leads you to this strange observation. So, for example, Edmund Neupert performing on the piano is one of GPT's predictions you just saw. But if you try other wordings, you start getting the feeling that maybe GPT doesn't really know what it's talking about. If we say Edmund Neupert is a virtuoso and ask GPT to complete it, it'll say he's a violinist. And if we use other wordings, like Edmund Neupert is known as a master of the, it's like he thinks he's an artist. If we ask for his favorite genre, it says it's horror, right? It actually doesn't seem to be consistent about Edmund Neupert at all. It was just sort of a lucky guess. Now, on the other hand, this inconsistency is not always there. So, for example, Niccolo Paganini, if we do exactly the same test on Niccolo Paganini, he performs on the violin. He's a virtuoso on the violin. He's a master of the violin. If you ask about his favorite genre, it's a symphony. It's very consistent. So models can know things robustly, but other times models can get things right where they don't really know things. And this is really the challenge we have with these large models. It can be very difficult to tell when the models are being smart about things and when they're not, because you can say something that may happen to be true without actually knowing it. Like Edmund Neupert performing on the piano, the model got that right, but it didn't really know anything about Edmund Neupert. And the flip side, you could be the opposite. You could actually know something in a situation where you're not actually saying it. Like you might know that Niccolo Paganini was a violinist when you're uttering sentences about how Niccolo Paganini likes the symphony and so on. And you might never mention his violin playing, but your knowledge of the fact that he's a violinist could be informing your behavior here. And so this idea of trying to understand what it is that a model knows is, I think, this is an example of how this will continue to be important and increasingly important as these models get larger and more capable. So chasing down this question of how the model like GPT knows something leads to these two research questions that I want to describe to you that you can crack using direct model editing. So the two questions are, can we actually locate where the factual knowledge is in GPT? And if you can find where it is, like which neurons are responsible for storing a fact, can you change those facts? Can you go into a model and redefine them? So this work I did with my student Kevin Meng, as well as Alex Andonia and Yonatan Belenkov, collaborators. It was great fun. And here's how the method works. We want to find out where in the model it knows some fact. Like Miles Davis plays the trumpet. So let me show you an example run. Miles Davis plays the trumpet. This is a run of GPT, and it's correct. And this is just a graph that describes all the nodes of GPT as it's doing the computations. The little red boxes are the attention modules, and the little green diamonds are the feed forward modules, and the representation of the words goes from purple circle to purple circle. Each purple circle represents a hidden state representation of vector that represents a word. And so after all these pieces of arithmetic go through, the model predicts trumpet. But what we want to know is which computation in this big graph was actually responsible for knowing that Miles Davis plays the trumpet. So what we can do is we can actually run, to find this out, we can actually run the model twice, and the second time we can corrupt the input to frustrate the computation. So for example, if we add noise to the input, what we do is we add noise to the input embedding of the subject name, there's no way the model will be able to guess the right instrument, right? So if it's sort of like if you ask somebody a question, but a big truck rolled by at the moment that the subject of the question was named, then you might have trouble answering, you know, blah, blah, blah plays the what? We have no idea. Who is it, right? So this model is no longer able to correctly output the word trumpet. But this corrupted run is useful because we can now go in and ask the question, is there some way of repairing this corrupted run to make it work? Now, the information no longer is coming from the input that it needs to predict the fact that Miles Davis plays the trumpet correctly. But what we can do is we can search the network for causal states. So this is really similar to the search for lamp lighting neurons that I showed you earlier in Audrey's project. But here, instead of just flipping neurons on and off, what we're going to do is we're going to search for decisive states by copying state vectors of neurons from the original clean run into the second corrupted run. And then the downstream computations they proceed as usual with the new data. And usually, if we copy one hidden state from the clean run to the corrupted run, it doesn't really help, right? The run is still corrupted. It still can't predict, what instrument is being played here. But once in a while, when we test all the states, we can find a state that causes the prediction to change. And so here, if I copy this state, the information flows all the way through the network to the end, and it makes the prediction become trumpet, the right answer. All I had to do was copy a single hidden state vector. And so this suggests that this vector is contains some decisive information needed for the prediction about Miles Davis's instrument that he plays. And so, so let me show you what kind of thing you can do here. If you plot this effect at every hidden state of the network, you get pictures like this. So this is a sentence about the Space Needle, which is a landmark that's located in Seattle. And the purple regions are the locations of the hidden state that cause the network to be able to predict Seattle correctly. The darkness of the color is the amount of change in the predicted probability. And so the interesting thing is that we find two discrete decisive sites, right? The site B, this late site at the last layers, at the last token, is not really surprising, because we know that if you change hidden states right before the prediction is going to be made, you'll have an effect on the prediction. What's really interesting is that there's this early site A in the middle layers at an early token that's also decisive. So the late site's not really surprising, but the early site is really interesting discovery. You can decompose this to different types of neurons. So if you transplant just the MLP neurons, you get the picture on the left. And if you decompose if you just copy over the attention neurons, you get the picture on the right. And so you can see that this really interesting early effect is really responsible. It's really the neurons that are really responsible for this early effect are the MLP neurons, these little green modules, and so the hypothesis is that the green neurons are actually the ones that are responsible for associating the word Space Needle with the semantic knowledge that it's in Seattle. So I've shown you one example. You can actually repeat this over hundreds, thousands of effects, and you find that these effects are systematic. There are two sites that are influential, that are causal, whenever you have a factual statement being predicted by the model. There's an early site and a late site, and the early site seems to be mediated by the mid-layer MLP modules, where we think that maybe facts are stored. So you can do this intervention in a more clever way by instead of, so if we think that the MLP computations, these little green diamonds, are the important ones, we can actually test that directly by copying the states over while disabling computation, disabling data flow through the MLP computations. So what I'm showing you here is what's called causal mediation analysis with path-dependent effects. And so what I'm doing here is I'm testing what is the effect of putting in a clean hidden state in a corrupted run if that clean hidden state is not allowed to pass through the MLP computations. Instead, the MLP computations are frozen in the corrupted state by using this sort of corrupted state data flow that I'm showing here. So if you do that, then it turns out that some hidden states have less causal effect than they had before, and other hidden states have the same causal effect as they had before. So let me show you that picture here. So what I'm showing you here in green, so in purple is the causal effect of hidden states at all the layers at the last subject token, averaged over 1,000 factual statements. And you can see that there are some early site, middle layer, uh, um, uh, uh, layers, hidden states that have a strong causal effect. Something between layers 10 and 20 have this peak. And if you ask, like, well, how does this causal effect happen? Well, the answer is it's mediated by the MLP layers, because if you sever the MLP layers, then you change the shape of the causal effects, and the hidden state at layer 10 is no longer causal for the prediction of, say, the instrument or the city or the fact that you're interested in, because it's no longer allowed to pass through the MLP layers. If you bring the MLP layers back, then it becomes causal again. So somewhere in the middle layers, between layers 10 and 20, there are important MLP layers that are essential for creating the causal effects. If you go past layer 20, then the causal effects seem to be unaffected by taking MLP layers away. So this really narrows down the location of factual knowledge inside GPT to these middle layers between layers 10 and 20 at the last subject token. So what are these middle layers doing? And is there something that we can do to test whether they contain factual knowledge or not? And so I'm not going to go into all the details of what we do in the paper, but the basic idea is that each one of those layers is just a function that maps inputs to outputs. And we can think of the role of those layers as an associative memory. So the question might be, so they just map inputs to outputs like this, just like any matrix will map inputs to outputs. And so what we're going to do is we're going to find the input that corresponds to a subject, like the word Space Needle, and understand how the mapping maps it to an output vector that maps to something that the model knows, like Seattle. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change that mapping so that instead of mapping to a vector that encodes Seattle, it maps to a vector that encodes Rome. So it turns out that you can actually find a very small rank 1 change in a layer of a network to do this. So this little change here that I'm diagramming is a rank 1 change in a single layer of the model that will have this effect. And I think I don't want to run too long on time, so I'm not going to cover all the details of that. But if you have questions, I can answer them in this session. I'll try to leave some room for questions. So the idea of the Rome method is to change a single layer so that instead of mapping from the normal knowledge that the model has, like Space Needle maps to Seattle, identify the input vector for Space Needle, identify the output vector for Seattle, and change that output vector to a new concept like Rome, and then rewrite that one layer, that one small set of neurons, so that when the input is Space Needle, it predicts some new fact instead. So that's the idea, direct model editing to change a fact. Okay, so the interesting thing is that when you do that, it's not actually very hard to get it so that the original sentence that you use to express the fact is rewritten. GPT will change its prediction after a single rank 1 change. It's quite easy to do this. But the thing that's really interesting when you do this is that GPT will actually change all of its entailed knowledge at the same time. So for example, if we ask it to complete this sentence, from the Space Needle, you'll see the waters of, it used to say things like the Puget Sound and Mount Rainier to the north. These are things that are near Seattle, but after you rewrite the model so that the Space Needle is in Rome instead, and you ask it to present, complete the same sentence, you get sentences like from the Space Needle, you can see the waters of the Tiber flowing into Rome. On a sentence like, visiting the Space Needle will give you a chance to brush up on your geography skills. Take in aerial views of Seattle. Instead, if the Space Needle were in Rome, GPT will predict that it's a good chance for you to brush up on your Latin. Enjoy great views of Rome. If you want to eat food near the Space Needle, GPT used to recommend that you eat the famous Space Burger, a very American snack. But if you rewrite the Space Needle to be in Rome, then the food that it recommends is to get the delicious pasta with the local sauce. So this is, I think there's really interesting validation that it's possible to go directly into a model and understand where it's storing its knowledge and what the implications of its knowledge are. So in order to do that, what we've done here is we've specified the change. We've started with a question like, the Space Needle is in the city of, and then we search for causal computations that cause the model to have some particular effect, like output the word Seattle. And then based on those causal computations, we go into the neurons that are important and we alter the network. And when we do that, we can see what the effects are and see what the surprising computations are. So we can see that Rome leads to the entailments of being able to see the Tiber River, for example. And so this is just like what we did before, where in images, we specified a change, we search for causal computations, we altered the neurons of the network to see what would happen. And so in our lab, we're extending this work to a lot of other settings. By directly editing the model's computations, we can learn limitations and biases in our models. And so I guess my takeaway is that we should all be driving towards trying to understand our models more directly with direct model editing. So that's my talk. I want to not take up too much time so that people have a chance to ask questions if you have any questions. So let me open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, David, for that interesting talk. Maybe I'll get the discussion started. So in your example with the light bulb, right? So when you're doing direct model editing, you try to identify a concept that maps to a neuron. So I was curious, is it always common to see a single neuron controlling the concept, or can there be like multiple affecting the single concept?
Yeah, this is really fascinating. I think that it depends on the architecture, and the architecture that we're showing you here is a StyleGAN. So there was a work, and I don't know if I have a slide that describes the work, called StyleSpace, which I think did a really nice job at analyzing the internal structure of StyleGAN and its behavior. But there are certain models that are just very, very good at disentangling the meaningful factors of variation. I think it's one of the most valuable things that deep models do, and I feel that it's important for us to seek out models that are capable of doing this. StyleGAN is very capable of doing it, and it turns out that not all of the neurons in the StyleGAN are so meaningful. It has many, many thousands of different types of neurons, but what the StyleSpace paper talked about was there's this set of 9,000 style neurons that are surprisingly meaningful. A large fraction of these 9,000 neurons are things that humans would say are, correspond to a particular visual concept. They control a particular visual part or a particular visual effect. So is it always individual neurons? Certainly not. But you definitely have networks where they generate a large number of these interesting causal individual neurons. Now I have to say that in GPT, we did not see individual neurons that encoded a complex fact like the Space Needles in Seattle. What I was showing you in GPT was vectors, but you also have to keep in mind that the GPT model is something like 1,000 times larger than the StyleGAN models. And if we take a single vector in GPT, a bunch of several hundred neurons, that's actually really, really tiny part of the entire model. And so even when you don't see individual neurons that are having an effect, you have you do see these effects where there's a high degree of locality of where things are in a model, where there's just a few vectors that make a big difference. And so looking for individual neurons is not always the way to go. But I think that looking for locality continues to be promising direction.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, thank you. Any more questions from? Yeah.
May I add to Sankar's question? So Sankar was asking whether multiple neurons are responsible for a single word. So I'm asking whether can we guarantee that the same neuron is always activated, or is it only valid for a specific kind of neural networks?
Oh, yes. So for each of these, so yeah, certainly, if you were to retrain StyleGAN or GPT again from scratch, then of course there's a symmetry in the networks, and there's no reason that neuron number 230 would have the same meaning the next time. It would be some completely different neuron. But these dominant concepts do get disentangled repeatedly. So if you were to train GPT again, would it know that Space Needle is in Seattle? Yes, it would know. Would that fact be localized to a small set of neurons? Yes, it would be localized. So we have many GPT models that we've tested. All the GPT models of different sizes and trained by different groups with slightly different architectures, and we see the effect across all of them. You can take the same fact, but of course it's different neurons, different layers in each architecture. They all have different numbers of layers and so on. But yes, the models tend to localize their knowledge, why they do this, I don't think it's fully understood. I think it's one of the effects that people like Geoff Hinton have been hunting for many years, for decades, since the 1980s. They've been looking for sort of localized representations of high-level concepts, and we're seeing these concepts emerge in these models, and maybe it's not an accident, because over the decades, everybody's been sort of looking for architectures that have the capability of representing these things, and so we tend to use these architectures. They're the same architectures that lead to strong capabilities.
Right. So that means some local symmetries there, like features can be localized even if it's not the same neuron. Like for example, like not for retraining, but for the same network, if we test with different variants, like the word light appearing in different sentences, and we test, so we can see that the neurons in the same locality will get always, like most of the time, get activated?
Right. So the interesting thing is that, okay, so wait, you're asking about the same network or different networks
Same
this
network.
time?
Same
Same network, yes. So, yeah, this was the interesting thing here for StyleGAN, and this is the thing that I think is most stunning, which is that once you identify where a concept is represented, these networks tend to have this amazing ability to generalize to different instances. So these examples that I showed you here are just random examples of images generated by StyleGAN that had lamps in them. They're completely unrelated to the example that we used to identify the neurons at the beginning, but but the examples have really strong causal effects where the same neuron affects them, and this is the same effect as what you see here with these entailments in language models, where if you sort of make let's see, if you sort of oops, if you sort of make a change in the weights of a model, then it doesn't just change out one word, but it actually changes this big footprint of what that word implies with lots of other examples. So this is the thing that I think is quite interesting. And let me say it this way. It is possible to find ways of changing a network that do not generalize. It's very easy to find ways of changing a network that don't generalize. It's very easy to find a small change I could make in a network so that when you ask it how to complete the sentence, the Space Needle's in the city of something, it says Rome instead of Seattle. There's countless ways of changing a network so that it will output that word. But most of those ways do not generalize. So for example, like one way I could do that that wouldn't generalize properly is to just modify GPT so that no matter what the input was, it always predicts the word Rome. So what sport does Michael Jordan play? He plays Rome, right? Where does Bill Gates live? Bill Gates lives in Rome, right? So like this would not properly generalize. It's not specific to the question. And you can also do it the opposite way, where you could make it so that GPT looks for this exact sentence and outputs the word Rome for that exact sentence. It has more than enough parameters to overfit to a particular example. And that would be similar to going to just that one image and just controlling the lights in that one image and not applying to any other images. But if you understand how the network is actually organizing its computation, you can actually find the layers where the high-level concept is being stored. And when you find that proper location, then it will actually generalize remarkably well. And so this is the picture really that I'm showing you here. These two locations are both locations where you could make a small effect and alter the prediction of where the Space Needle is. But the later one doesn't generalize, but the early one does. And the fact that there is an early local site that leads to these highly general things is really interesting. And it's the kind of thing that we need to be hunting for in these models.
Great. Thank you very much for the answer.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap up the discussion for now. We can continue in the panel discussion again. So
Great.
let me thank Prof. David again.